They arrived in summer, when the corn stood tall enough to hide a man. The trains that brought them west from the Atlantic ports moved slowly through a landscape so vast it seemed to mock the very notion of borders. These were soldiers of the Third Reich, captured in North Africa or Italy or France, men who had expected death or degradation and found instead something they could not name. The camps that received them were sparse but orderly, arranged on former fairgrounds or hastily erected on farmland that stretched to horizons unbroken by anything but grain elevators and water towers. They had been told America was weak, corrupted by Jewish influence and racial mixing, a civilization in decline waiting to be conquered. What they found instead was space, endless, indifferent, abundant space, and a quietness that felt like its own kind of power. The camp in central Nebraska held nearly 2,000 men behind wire fences that seemed almost apologetic in their construction. Guard towers stood at intervals, but the rifles pointed outward seemed more ceremonial than menacing. The barracks were clean, the latrines functional, the food more plentiful than anything they had eaten in the final months of combat. At night, lying on bunks that did not reek of gangrene or despair, they could hear the wind moving through crops they would soon be harvesting. Some of the younger prisoners wept quietly in the darkness, not from grief, but from a confusion so profound it felt like grief's cousin. They had been taught that capture meant torture, that Americans were soft and vindictive, that this war would end in either their glorious victory or their meaningful martyrdom. Instead, they found themselves in a place that felt less like punishment than exile, removed from history into a land where history seemed to operate under different rules entirely. The first morning, they were divided into work details. The war had drained America's farms of young men, and the government had made a pragmatic calculation. Prisoners could labor under supervision, earning small wages while keeping the nation fed. The Geneva Convention permitted it, encouraged it even, and so the Germans found themselves loaded into trucks at dawn and driven to fields where American farmers waited with instructions and uncertainty. Some of these farmers were old men whose sons were fighting in Europe. Others were women managing land their husbands had left behind. Many bore surnames that stopped the prisoners cold: Schmidt, Mueller, Hoffman, Klein, names that echoed across the Atlantic like words shouted into a canyon. The realization came slowly at first, then with gathering force. Millions of Germans had come to this place generations before, had planted themselves in this soil, had prospered in ways the fatherland never permitted. A prisoner named Ernst Kellerman, who had been a school teacher before the war, found himself assigned to a dairy farm run by a widow named Edith Bachmann. Her father had emigrated from Baden in the 1880s, fleeing conscription and poverty, and had bought land when it cost almost nothing. Now she owned 300 acres and 40 head of cattle, managing it all with her teenage daughter and an elderly hired man who moved slowly but knew every inch of ground by heart. Ernst had expected contempt or at minimum cold efficiency. What he received instead was instruction delivered in accented German that sounded like his grandmother's voice, softened by distance and dialect drift. Frau Bachmann showed him how to operate the milking machines, modern equipment he had never seen in Bavaria, and watched as he learned the rhythm of it, the animals calm, the process swift, the milk flowing into steel containers that would be collected by refrigerated trucks before noon. Everything functioned with a precision that belied propaganda about democratic chaos. Everything worked because people made it work, not because some distant authority commanded it. The abundance was what struck them most forcefully. In the camp mess hall, they ate portions larger than what their families back home would see in a week, even before the bombing intensified. White bread, butter, meat at nearly every meal, coffee that didn't taste like acorns, fruit that appeared as if the continent itself was a garden requiring no tending. Some prisoners initially refused to eat, convinced it was a trick or that accepting such bounty made them collaborators in their own defeat. But hunger is not ideological, and within days even the most fervent believers were cleaning their plates and asking for seconds. They learned that American farms produced more food than the nation could consume, that silos stood full while ships carried wheat to allies across oceans, that this surplus was not the result of plunder, but of mechanization and land so fertile it seemed eager to yield. The cognitive dissonance was profound. They had been taught that Germany needed expansion to survive, that the Reich required living space because the homeland could not sustain its people. Yet here was proof that organization and freedom produce prosperity in ways conquest never could. Sunday mornings brought a ritual that confused them further. The prisoners were permitted, even encouraged, to attend church services. The Americans, it seemed, believed that faith was a right rather than a privilege, and they made no distinction between their own worship and that of enemy soldiers. Chaplains arrived to conduct Lutheran services in German, and the men gathered in a converted warehouse to sing hymns they had learned as children. The experience was disorienting, to bow their heads before the same God while wearing the uniforms of a defeated cause, to pray in a language their captors' grandparents had spoken, to hear scripture in words that predated borders and battlefields. Some found comfort there, a continuity with something older than Hitler or Roosevelt or any nation-state. Others felt only shame, wondering how they had been convinced to fight for a regime that would have burned these very churches if given the chance. The American families that attended services in the nearby chapel were not afraid of them. Children stared with curiosity rather than hatred. Old women who had fled Germany decades before looked at these prisoners with something approaching pity, as if seeing their own sons or grandsons caught in a nightmare they had been wise enough to escape.
Letters home were permitted once a month, censored but not prohibited. Ernst wrote to his wife, who remained in their small apartment in Regensburg with their daughter. He could not tell her where he was exactly, could not describe the camp's location or defenses, but he could say that he was safe, fed, working on a farm. He struggled with what else to say. How could he explain that the people here lived better than German aristocrats? That farmers drove automobiles as casually as Berliners rode trams? That the grocery stores, what they called supermarkets, sold varieties of food he didn't know existed? How could he convey that the descendants of German emigrants had built something extraordinary without ever firing a shot? That they had become wealthy and free precisely because they had abandoned the rigid hierarchies the fatherland cherished? He wrote instead about the weather, about learning to milk cows, about the kindness of his captors. But between the lines, anyone reading carefully might detect a shift, a quiet bewilderment, a loosening of certainties that had once felt absolute.
Letters home were permitted once a month, censored but not prohibited. Ernst wrote to his wife, who remained in their small apartment in Regensburg with their daughter. He could not tell her where he was exactly, could not describe the camp's location or defenses, but he could say that he was safe, fed, working on a farm. Winter came hard that year, snow falling early and deep across the plains. The work shifted to indoor tasks, repairing equipment, maintaining buildings, helping in workshops where furniture was mended or machinery serviced. The prisoners learned to ice skate on a frozen pond near the camp, taught by guards who seemed to find the whole situation as strange as their charges did. They celebrated Christmas with services and concerts, and the Americans provided extra food, small gifts, letters from home that had been held up in military censors and finally cleared. Ernst received word that his wife and daughter were alive, living with relatives in the countryside after their apartment building had been destroyed in a bombing raid. The relief was overwhelming, but incomplete. They were alive, but everything else was gone. The world they had known, the Germany they had believed in, existed now only in memory and ruin. What would he tell his daughter when he finally saw her again? How would he explain that everything he had taught her was wrong, that the enemy had been right, that the cause they had sacrificed for was not just defeated, but deserving of defeat? The winter months brought a different kind of education, one that happened in conversations rather than work. The Americans organized discussion groups, voluntary gatherings where prisoners could talk about politics, history, the future of Germany.
At first, only a few attended, suspicious of propaganda or unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths, but gradually more came, drawn by curiosity or boredom, or a genuine hunger to understand how everything had gone so wrong. The discussions were led by German-speaking Americans, often professors or clergy or businessmen who had volunteered for this strange duty. They did not lecture or condemn. Instead, they asked questions, posed scenarios, challenged assumptions with a gentleness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. They asked the prisoners to consider what Germany had been before 1933, what it might become after the war, whether strength and greatness required the machinery of totalitarianism, or if other paths existed. Some prisoners argued fiercely, defending the ideals, if not the execution, insisting that Germany had been wronged by Versailles and had every right to reclaim its place among nations. Others listened in silence, processing ideas that contradicted everything they had been taught, but aligned with everything they had observed since arriving in this strange land. Ernst attended these sessions religiously, sitting in the back and rarely speaking, but absorbing every word. He found himself thinking about his students, the children he had taught to salute and march and believe in the 1,000-year Reich. What were they learning now, in schools run by occupation authorities or in no schools at all? How would they process the ruins around them, the absent fathers, the shame that would attach itself to their generation like a birthmark? He thought about the education he had received, the way history had been taught as a progression toward German greatness, the way dissent had been discouraged and conformity rewarded. And he thought about the education happening here, in a prison camp on the American plains, where former enemies treated their captives not as monsters, but as men who had been misled and might yet be redeemed. The generosity of it was almost painful. It would have been easier, in some ways, to be hated, to be punished, to receive the judgment they undoubtedly deserved. Instead, they were being offered something more difficult, the chance to change, to admit error, to become something other than what they had been. Spring arrived late but sudden, the snow melting in sheets and the land turning to mud before greening almost overnight. The prisoners returned to outdoor work, planting crops this time instead of harvesting them. Ernst found himself back at the Bachmann farm, preparing fields for corn and soybeans. Frau Bachmann was quieter this spring, and he eventually learned why. Her son, who had been fighting in the Pacific, had been killed on some island whose name she couldn't pronounce. She showed Ernst the telegram, folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear through the paper, and she wept in a way that transcended nationality or language. Grief is grief, whether felt in German or English, whether for a soldier of the Reich or the Republic. Ernst found himself weeping with her, this woman whose son had died fighting his countrymen, and in that moment, whatever remained of his ideological certainty dissolved completely. They were not enemies, not really. They were people caught in a machinery of violence that none of them had built, but all of them had fed. And the only way forward was to dismantle that machinery, piece by piece, starting with the machinery in their own minds. The other prisoners noticed the change in Ernst, the way he no longer defended the old regime even in mild terms, the way he spoke about the future with something approaching hope rather than despair. Some accused him of collaboration, of betraying Germany by accepting propaganda. Others simply withdrew, unable to face the same questions he had confronted. But a few followed his example, attending the discussion groups, reading the books in the camp library, trying to understand how a nation as cultured and educated as Germany descended into barbarism. They learned about the Weimar Republic, not as the weak and corrupt failure they had been taught to despise, but as a genuine attempt at democracy undermined by economic crisis and political extremism. They learned about the Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act, the machinery of dictatorship assembled piece by piece while ordinary Germans looked away or applauded. They learned that what happened to Germany could happen anywhere, that no nation was immune to the seductions of authoritarianism, that vigilance and civic participation were not luxuries but necessities for any society that hoped to remain free. Otto Weiss approached these questions from a different angle. As a factory foreman, he had been concerned with practical matters, production schedules, efficiency, the mechanics of getting things done. He had joined the party not out of ideological fervor, but because membership was necessary for advancement, because refusing meant stagnation or worse. He had not been political in the way Ernst had been, had not taught children to worship the state or volunteered for the stormtroopers, but he had gone along, had enabled the regime through his competence and silence, and now he had to reckon with that complicity. What struck him most about America was how much got done without coercion. The grain elevator operated smoothly not because workers feared punishment, but because they took pride in their work and were compensated fairly. The farmers brought their crops to market not because the state demanded it, but because they profited from doing so. The entire economic system ran on incentives and voluntary exchange, rather than directives and threats. It seemed almost anarchic at first, this system without a master plan, without a Führer to guide everything toward national greatness. But it worked. It produced abundance, innovation, prosperity, distributed more widely than under any planned economy. The lesson was humbling. Trust was more efficient than control, cooperation more productive than coercion, freedom more powerful than force. By the summer of 1945, the prisoners had been working American farms for 2 full growing seasons. They knew the land now, knew the rhythms of planting and harvest, knew the families they worked for and the communities they lived in. Some had been allowed to attend town events, county fairs, barn dances, 4th of July celebrations, always under supervision, but increasingly accepted as temporary members of a society that seemed to have room for everyone willing to work and behave decently. They watched Americans celebrate their independence with fireworks and picnics and patriotic speeches that emphasized freedom and opportunity rather than blood and soil. They saw how American patriotism, at least in these small towns, was loud and cheerful rather than martial and menacing. People loved their country but did not worship it, respected their flag but did not kill for it, honored their history while acknowledging its flaws. This seemed to be the key difference. American identity was civic rather than ethnic, chosen rather than inherited, built on ideas rather than ancestry. Anyone could become American by embracing those ideas and participating in the democratic process. Germany had no equivalent. Being German was a matter of blood and language and thousand-year heritage, immutable and exclusionary. No wonder the American system produced unity from diversity, while the German system had produced conformity through violence. The war in Europe ended in May, and the news reached the prisoners through radio broadcasts and newspapers. There were no celebrations among the prisoners, no grief, only a kind of exhausted acknowledgement. It was over. The Reich had lasted 12 years instead of 1,000. The cities were rubble, the armies destroyed, the leadership dead by suicide or headed for trial. For prisoners like Ernst and Otto, the end brought not relief but uncertainty. What now? Return to a country that no longer existed in any recognizable form? Remain in America as refugees or immigrants? Face judgment from victors who had every right to be merciless? The Americans seemed not to have decided. The repatriation process would take time, resources were limited, and there was no rush to send men back to a devastated landscape. So they stayed through that summer and into autumn, still working the farms, still attending church, still writing letters to families who might or might not receive them. Some prisoners began to study English seriously, sensing that whatever future awaited them might involve this language and this land. The Americans provided classes, textbooks, patient instructors who seemed to believe that education could bridge any divide. The prisoners learned vocabulary and grammar, practiced conversations, and discovered that English was both easier and harder than they expected. Easier in its simplified grammar, harder in its chaotic spelling and idioms that made no logical sense. But they persisted because purpose matters, and learning gave them purpose in a time when purpose was scarce. They began to understand American humor, which relied on irreverence and self-deprecation rather than cruelty or superiority. They learned that Americans mocked their own politicians, criticized their own government, argued loudly about everything, and then worked together anyway. This was freedom in practice, messy, noisy, inefficient, and somehow producing results that surpassed any authoritarian system's careful planning. Ernst became nearly fluent by autumn. His teaching skills transferred easily to language acquisition. He helped other prisoners with their lessons, translating instructions and explaining idioms, and in the process found a new vocation. He began to imagine a future as a teacher again, but teaching differently, emphasizing critical thinking and democratic values rather than obedience and national greatness. He wrote long letters to his wife describing this transformation, trying to prepare her for the man who would return to her, similar in body but different in mind, carrying ideas that might seem strange or treasonous to someone who had endured the war in Germany rather than America. Her replies, when they came, were cautious but open. She wrote of neighbors who had been party members, now claiming they had always opposed Hitler, of women who had lost everything learning to survive in ruins, of an exhaustion so profound that felt like wisdom. Everyone wanted the same thing: peace, food, safety, a chance to rebuild without being drafted into someone else's vision of greatness. If Ernst had learned things that might help, then he should share them. Germany had tried its own way and failed catastrophically. Perhaps it was time to learn from others.
By late 1945, some prisoners were being sent home. Ernst received his orders in November and felt neither joy nor dread, only numbness. The train journey east was quiet, men lost in private thoughts about futures they could not imagine. They boarded ships in New York Harbor, passing the Statue of Liberty that they had seen in photographs but never in person. The symbolism was too obvious to mention. This gift from France to America, this welcome to immigrants, this promise of freedom lighting the world while Europe had descended into darkness. The voyage across the Atlantic took weeks, and during that time Ernst wrote in a journal he had been keeping, trying to record what he had learned before forgetting became easier than remembering. He wrote about Frau Bachmann teaching him to milk cows, about the abundance of American grocery stores, about church services in German and hymns that sounded like home. He wrote about the film he had watched, the evidence he could not deny, the shame that would follow him forever. And he wrote about democracy, not as an abstract concept, but as something he had witnessed functioning, imperfectly but genuinely, creating prosperity and freedom and the space for people to become their best selves rather than cogs in someone else's machine. They arrived in Bremerhaven in January 1946, stepping off the ship into a country that no longer existed. The Germany they had known was gone, replaced by occupied zones and reconstruction efforts, and a population trying to process guilt and grief simultaneously. Ernst made his way to the village where his wife and daughter were staying, walking roads lined with refugees and rubble, passing cities reduced to moonscapes. When he finally found them, in a farmhouse they shared with two other families, the reunion was quiet and careful. His daughter was taller, thinner, older in ways that had nothing to do with years. His wife held him and asked questions he could not answer. Where had he been exactly? What had he done? Had he known about the camps? He told her about Nebraska, about working on a farm, about Americans with German names. He did not yet tell her about the transformation he had undergone, the collapse of everything he once believed. That would take time. Conversations stretched across months and years, a slow rebuilding of trust and understanding. Some prisoners never went home. They filed paperwork to remain in the United States, became immigrants sponsored by the families they had worked for, found ways to stay in a country that had once been their enemy. Otto Weiss was among them. He had no family left in Germany, his parents dead in bombing raids, his siblings scattered or killed, and the Fairbury grain elevator offered him permanent employment. He married an American woman whose father had been born in Württemberg, a union that seemed to symbolize the strange reconciliations the war had produced. They bought a small house on a quiet street, raised children who grew up speaking English and learned German only as a curiosity, a connection to a grandfather they never knew. Otto attended Lutheran services every Sunday in a church founded by German immigrants in 1887, singing hymns in the language he had spoken as a soldier. He never forgot where he came from or what he had been, but he also never stopped being grateful for the accident of capture that had brought him to a place where second chances were possible and the past did not have to determine the future. The influence of these men on post-war Germany is difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore.
Ernst became a teacher again, but in the American zone of occupation, working in schools being reorganized around democratic principles. He taught his students about America, not as propaganda, but as example, a place where German immigrants had thrived precisely because they embraced freedom rather than clinging to old hierarchies. He taught them about civic responsibility, the importance of questioning authority, the way democracy requires active participation rather than passive obedience. His methods were different from those of traditional German pedagogy. He encouraged debate, rewarded curiosity, praised students who challenged his ideas rather than simply accepting them. Some colleagues viewed him with suspicion, wondering if he had been corrupted by his captivity. Others recognized in his approach the kind of education Germany needed if it hoped to avoid repeating its catastrophic mistakes. Slowly, over years, these ideas spread, not because they were imposed by occupation authorities, but because they worked, because students educated this way became thoughtful citizens rather than obedient subjects, because democratic culture could not be ordered from above but had to grow from below. Other former prisoners entered different fields, carrying similar lessons. Some became journalists, writing for newspapers in the Western zones that emphasized factual reporting over propaganda, that held officials accountable rather than celebrating them, that treated readers as intelligent adults capable of forming their own opinions. Some entered politics, joining the Christian Democrats or Social Democrats or other parties that were learning to compete for votes rather than seize power through violence. Some became businessmen, applying lessons learned in American factories and farms about efficiency through cooperation, about the value of treating workers as partners rather than servants, about long-term thinking over short-term exploitation. And some simply became ordinary citizens who had seen enough of authoritarianism to recognize its early warning signs, who would not be silent when politicians promised to make Germany great again through the same methods that had led to ruin before. The Marshall Plan gets credit for Germany's economic recovery, and deservedly so. American aid rebuilt infrastructure, restarted factories, provided the capital needed for reconstruction. But capital alone does not create a functioning democracy. That requires something more intangible, a shared understanding of how democratic societies work, a willingness to compromise, a recognition that political opponents are not enemies to be destroyed, but fellow citizens with different ideas. The former prisoners of war contributed to this understanding in ways that rarely appeared in official histories. They had lived in democracy, even as captives, and could speak about it from experience rather than theory. They knew that freedom did not mean chaos because they had seen orderly American towns where people governed themselves without needing a Führer to tell them what to do. They knew that prosperity did not require conquest because they had worked American farms that produced abundance through technology and cooperation rather than plunder. They knew that strength and gentleness were not opposites because they had been treated humanely by people who had defeated them utterly in war. The Basic Law, adopted in 1949, reflected some of these lessons. Its emphasis on federalism dispersed power in ways that would have been anathema to the centralizers of the Reich. Its protection of human dignity made clear that the state existed to serve the people, not the other way around. Its provisions for judicial review ensured that no leader could accumulate dictatorial power by exploiting legal loopholes. These were not uniquely American ideas. They drew on German constitutional traditions from before 1933, on British parliamentary practice, on French revolutionary ideals, but they were very much in line with what the former prisoners had observed in America. Germany was learning to become, in some ways, like the German-American communities that had flourished for generations in the Midwest, proud of heritage but not imprisoned by it, orderly but not authoritarian, strong because its people were free rather than subjugated.
The transformation was never complete, of course. No society changes completely in a generation. Former Nazis remained in positions of authority well into the 1960s, their pasts overlooked or minimized in the interest of stability and continuity. The German Democratic Republic in the East built a different kind of authoritarianism, one that called itself socialist, but replicated many of the control mechanisms the Reich had perfected. Even in the West, democracy was fragile at first.
dependent on economic growth and American protection, and the exhaustion that made people unwilling to contemplate another catastrophe. But it took root. Children grew up learning to question rather than obey, to debate rather than submit, to see government as something they participated in rather than something that ruled over them. Universities became centers of free inquiry rather than indoctrination factories. The press became genuinely free, skeptical of power rather than subservient to it. And Germany became, gradually, the kind of nation the emigrants had tried to build in America: prosperous, peaceful, democratic, and strong enough to defend those qualities without resorting to the brutality that had once defined German power. The prisoners themselves rarely spoke about their role in this transformation. Most lived quiet lives, grateful to have survived the war and content to leave politics to others. Ernst Kellermann taught school until his retirement in 1970, then wrote a memoir that was published to little fanfare and is now out of print. He described his time as a prisoner of war as the most educational experience of his life, a forced confrontation with ideas he had spent years rejecting and might never have encountered otherwise. He wrote about Frau Bachmann and her son who died in the Pacific, about the abundance of American grocery stores and the freedom of American churches, about the moment he watched footage of concentration camps and realized he had been complicit through his silence and obedience in crimes beyond comprehension. He wrote about returning to Germany and finding a purpose in helping to build a different kind of education system, one that might prevent future generations from making the mistakes his had made. The book sold a few thousand copies and was reviewed respectfully but not enthusiastically. By the 1970s, Germany was tired of dwelling on the war years. People wanted to look forward rather than backward, to celebrate economic success rather than confront moral failure. But Ernst's memoir remained, a small contribution to the historical record, a testament to the idea that even enemies can learn from each other if given the chance. Otto Weiss never wrote a book, but he lived the lesson in a different way. His children grew up American, with only the vaguest connection to his father's homeland. They knew he had been a soldier, had been captured, and had decided to stay in America rather than return to a ruined country. But they did not know the details, the transformation he had undergone, the way working at a grain elevator in Nebraska had taught him that efficiency did not require brutality, and prosperity did not require conquest. Otto preferred it that way. He had made peace with his past by building a future that had nothing to do with it. He was not running from history, but simply living beyond it, proving that people could change nationality and loyalty and identity if they chose to, that the past did not have to determine the future, that redemption was possible even for those who had fought for the most evil regime in modern history. When he died in 1988, his obituary in the Fairbury newspaper mentioned that he had emigrated after World War II and had worked at the grain elevator for 43 years. It did not mention that he had been a prisoner of war, that he had fought for Nazi Germany, that he had discovered democracy through activity. His family knew, but they saw no reason to emphasize it. He had been a good father, a reliable worker, a quiet member of the community who paid his taxes and attended church and lived according to the values he had learned in the country that had defeated him and then offered him a home. The irony was profound and went largely unremarked. The prisoners of war had been captured by a version of Germany that succeeded precisely because it was no longer Germany. The immigrants who had fled the rigid hierarchies and militarism of the 19th century had built something new in American soil, a German culture shorn of authoritarianism, a German work ethic wedded to democratic values, a German thoroughness applied to the project of freedom rather than conquest. What the prisoners encountered was not just American prosperity, but a mirror showing them what their own culture could achieve when liberated from the weight of empire and Lebensraum and racial destiny. The United States was not perfect. Its treatment of Black Americans belied its democratic ideals. Its conquest of indigenous peoples revealed the same appetite for expansion Germany had exhibited. Its wealth was built partly on labor and resources extracted from others. But it was also undeniably functional, prosperous, powerful in ways the Reich had never approached, despite all its grandiose claims. And the German-American communities the prisoners encountered had achieved something extraordinary. They had preserved what was valuable in German culture: the emphasis on education, the love of music and philosophy, the commitment to craftsmanship, while abandoning what was toxic. They were proof that Germany could exist, and even flourish, without militarism, that German identity did not require authoritarian government, and that the fatherland's insistence on its own special path had been a catastrophic mistake. Years later, when historians began to study the post-war transformation of West Germany, they would focus on the Marshall Plan and denazification and the influence of American occupation authorities. They would analyze the basic law and the economic miracle and the role of individual leaders like Konrad Adenauer. But there was another influence, quieter and more personal, carried by men who had been prisoners and who brought home not just memories of defeat, but visions of what might be possible. They had learned that prosperity came from cooperation, that strength came from freedom, that a nation could be powerful without being cruel. They had seen farms run by families with German names, churches where German hymns were sung, communities that maintained cultural traditions while embracing democratic values. They had witnessed the paradox of immigration, that people fleeing their homeland could create a better version of it elsewhere, that the very act of leaving could be an act of preservation rather than betrayal. And some of them understood that Germany's future lay not in recovering what had been lost, but in building something new, informed by what they had witnessed in the land of their former enemies. The farms that they had worked continued their cycles, planting and harvest, generation after generation. The Bachmann farm passed to Edith's daughter, who married a veteran returned from the Pacific, and together they expanded the operation, buying neighboring land and modernizing equipment. They never forgot the German prisoners who had worked their fields during the war years, though the memory grew distant as decades passed. Sometimes, at family gatherings, someone would mention the prisoner named Ernst who had learned to milk cows and who had wept with Edith when news came of her son's death. The story would be told briefly, without drama, a strange episode in the farm's long history. No one knew what became of Ernst after he returned to Germany. No one thought to search for him, to write a letter, to maintain a connection across the ocean. The war had brought them together briefly and then separated them forever, which seemed to be the way of such things. History moved forward, leaving behind only traces. But the traces mattered. In the 1950s, as West Germany began to stabilize and prosper, visitors from America noticed something curious. The new Germany seemed familiar in unexpected ways. The emphasis on federalism, the commitment to social welfare balanced with free markets, the determination to rebuild without seeking revenge or dominance, these reflected not just American occupation policy, but something deeper, a transformation in how Germans conceived of themselves and their place in the world. The visitors, especially German Americans returning to ancestral homelands they had left decades before, recognized elements of their own communities in this new Germany. The careful balance between order and freedom, the respect for tradition combined with openness to change, the understanding that strength could be expressed through cooperation rather than domination, these were values that had allowed German immigrants to thrive in America, and now they were being applied to Germany itself. Whether this was coincidence or influence remained unclear. History is never monocausal. The post-war transformation of Germany resulted from countless factors, countless decisions made by countless individuals. But among those individuals were men who had spent years working American farms, attending American churches, learning American ways, and who had returned home changed by the experience. The Korean War brought some of these men back into American consciousness. West Germany was rearming, carefully and under strict limits, joining NATO and contributing to the defense of Western Europe. Some former prisoners of war joined the new Bundeswehr, applying military skills learned in the Wehrmacht to the service of a democratic state. Others opposed rearmament entirely, arguing that Germany had earned the right to be permanently peaceful through the catastrophe it had inflicted on the world. The debate was intense. touching the deepest questions about national identity and historical responsibility. But the debate itself was democratic, conducted in parliaments, in newspapers, and public squares, resolved through votes rather than violence, producing compromise rather than absolutism. This was the education taking effect, the slow internalization of democratic norms. Germans were learning to argue without needing a Führer to decide who was right, to compete for power without seeking to annihilate opponents, to accept defeat at the ballot box without resorting to the streets. The process was messy and incomplete, but it was happening. And among those who made it happen were men who had spent years working American farms, attending American churches, learning American ways, and who had returned home changed by the experience. Ernst Kellermann's daughter became a teacher like her father, specializing in history and civics. She taught the post-war generation, children born into the ruins who had no memory of the Reich and no nostalgia for its promised glory. She taught them about democracy not as in foreign imposition, but as a hard-won achievement, something Germans had learned through catastrophic failure and patient reconstruction. She taught them about the immigrants, the millions who had left Germany in the 19th century and built prosperous lives in America, demonstrating that German culture could flourish without authoritarianism. And she taught them about complexity, the way history resists simple narratives of good and evil, the way ordinary people can commit extraordinary crimes through obedience and fear, the way redemption is possible, but never easy or complete. Her students grew up to be the generation that finally confronted the full horror of the Holocaust, that demanded accountability from their parents and grandparents, that insisted Germany could not move forward without acknowledging what it had been. This confrontation was painful, but necessary, a working through of trauma that authoritarian systems never permit. And it was made possible, in part, by an educational culture that valued questioning over obedience, that encouraged students to challenge their teachers, that understood democracy required citizens capable of thinking for themselves. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and suddenly the two Germanys had to become one again. The process was difficult, revealing how completely the East had remained trapped in authoritarian patterns while the West had transformed. East Germans had lived under constant surveillance, had learned to keep their true thoughts private, had been taught that the state was always right, even when it was obviously wrong. West Germans had learned to criticize their government, to organize civil society, to participate in democracy as active citizens rather than passive subjects. The integration of these two political cultures would take decades and remains incomplete even now. But it happened, and it happened peacefully, through negotiation and compromise rather than conquest or revolution. The new Germany that emerged was larger and more complex, carrying the scars of division but also the hope that healing was possible, that even the deepest wounds could close if given time and care. And this new Germany, unified and democratic, bore little resemblance to the Reich that had started the war. It was smaller in territory but larger in moral authority, weaker in military power but stronger in economic influence, humbler in rhetoric but more confident in values. It had learned the lesson the prisoners of war had brought home from Nebraska, that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from building a society where people are free to build themselves. The 21st century brought new challenges. Immigration transformed Germany's demographics, bringing in millions from Turkey, Syria, and elsewhere, testing the limits of tolerance and integration. The European Union created a new kind of German influence, economic rather than military, based on trade and regulation rather than conquest and occupation. The financial crisis of 2008 and the refugee crisis of 2015 revealed that democracy's problems were never solved permanently, that each generation had to relearn the lessons and apply them to new circumstances. But Germany navigated these challenges as a democracy, with all the mess and compromise and frustration that entails. There were no strongmen promising simple solutions, no Führer emerging to restore order through force, no return to the authoritarian patterns that had led to catastrophe. The lessons had been learned deeply enough to become instinctive, passed down through generations who had never known anything but democracy and could not imagine living under anything else. The prisoners of war who had worked American farms in the 1940s were almost all gone by then. Their direct influence faded into history, but the influence remained, diffused through the institutions they had helped build, the students they had taught, the values they had modeled. History is like that. Individual contributions vanish into the collective. Causes become impossible to trace, but the effects persist.
The sky over the plains of Nebraska is wide and indifferent, caring nothing for the dramas of history or the ideologies of nations. The corn still grows there. The grain elevators still fill with wheat. The churches still hold services in buildings that have stood for more than a century. The camp where Ernst Donato and 2,000 other men spent their wartime exile is gone now, reclaimed by farmland or developed into suburban housing. There are no monuments, no historical markers, no indication that this place once held defeated soldiers who were transformed by simple exposure to an alternative way of living. But the influence remains, invisible and persistent, in the choices made by men who saw two visions of what Germany could be and chose the one built on freedom rather than conquest. They had come as soldiers of a lost empire and left as witnesses to another kind of strength, one that asked for no loyalty oaths, demanded no worship of leaders, but built its power from trust and law, and the stubborn belief that people could govern themselves if given the chance. In the end, the story of these prisoners is a story about learning, about the possibility of change, about the way even the most deeply held beliefs can be overturned by experience. They had been taught that democracy was weak, that freedom bred chaos, that only authoritarian discipline could create a great nation. What they learned instead was that these teachings were lies, designed to justify a system that benefited only those at the top while grinding everyone else into compliance and suffering. They learned that democracy was not perfect, but it was better, that freedom was not chaotic, but creative, that greatness measured in prosperity and happiness rather than territory and conquest was the only greatness worth pursuing. Some learned these lessons quickly, others slowly, and some never learned them at all. But enough learned, and carried the knowledge home, and applied it to the work of rebuilding a shattered nation. Their contribution was quiet, undramatic, easily overlooked. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They had fought for evil and lost, and no amount of personal transformation could erase that fact. But they were witnesses, and their testimony mattered. And the Germany they helped create stands as proof that nations, like individuals, can change course, can learn from mistakes, can become something better than what they were. The prisoners who remained in America became part of a different story, one of immigration and assimilation and the constant remaking of national identity that defines the American experiment. Otto Weiss and men like him joined the millions who had come before, adding their experiences to the vast tapestry of stories that make up American history. They were never quite American in the way their children would be, never fully comfortable in English, never completely free from the weight of where they had come from and what they had done. But they were American enough, and that was what mattered. They worked, they paid taxes, they voted, and sent their children to public schools where they learned to be citizens of a democracy. They proved that even former enemies could become neighbors, that the boundaries between us and them were less fixed than anyone imagined, that identity was something that could be chosen and changed rather than merely inherited. This too was a lesson worth learning, worth passing down, worth remembering when new conflicts arise and new divisions threaten to harden into permanent enmity. The letters stopped eventually. Ernst wrote to Frau Bachmann once after returning to Germany, thanking her for her kindness and telling her about his work as a teacher. She wrote back briefly, saying she was glad he had survived and found purpose in education. They exchanged Christmas cards for a few years, but the correspondence dwindled and then ceased. There was no dramatic break, no falling out, simply the natural drift that occurs when people separated by an ocean and a language barrier and vastly different daily realities try to maintain a connection forged in unusual circumstances. But the memory remained.
Ernst never forgot those mornings milking cows in the Nebraska dawn, the patience with which Frau Bachmann had taught him, the way she had treated him as a person rather than an enemy. And she never forgot the young German soldier who had worked her farm and wept with her when her son died, who had seemed so different from the monsters the propaganda had described. These memories were private, rarely shared, not the stuff of history books or a public commemoration, but they were real, and they mattered, and they stand as evidence that even in the midst of catastrophic violence, humanity persists, connections form, and the future remains open to possibilities that the present cannot imagine. The grain elevator in Fairbury where Otto worked was torn down in the 1990s, replaced by a modern facility with computer controls and minimal human labor. Progress, they called it. Though something was lost when the old building came down. The physical space where enemies had become co-workers, where a German soldier had learned that efficiency did not require cruelty, where the mechanics of democracy had been demonstrated through the simple act of working together toward a common goal. No one thought to preserve it. Why would they? It was just an old grain elevator in a small Nebraska town. Nothing special, nothing worth saving. History happens in famous places, at crucial moments, through the actions of great men. Or so we tell ourselves. But history also happens in grain elevators, and dairy farms, and prison camps, in the small moments when one person shows kindness to another, when ideas are challenged and changed, when the future is shaped by ordinary people making ordinary choices that accumulate into something extraordinary. The last of the German prisoners of war held in America died sometime in the early 2000s. Their passing noted in local obituaries, if noted at all. With them went the direct memory of that strange period when hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers lived and worked in the American heartland, experiencing democracy firsthand in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. But the indirect memory remains, carried by their children and students and the institutions they helped shape. In Germany, the post-war generation that rebuilt the nation as a democracy has mostly passed as well, replaced by grandchildren and great-grandchildren who take freedom for granted and sometimes forget how recently and how narrowly it was won. This is both natural and dangerous. Democracy's survival depends on each generation choosing to maintain it, to participate in it, to defend it when threatened. The lessons learned by prisoners of war in Nebraska were never meant to be learned once and then forgotten. They were meant to be taught and retaught, remembered and re-remembered, applied to new circumstances as they arise. The story ends where it began, with land and work and the quiet persistence of ordinary life. The farms of Nebraska continue their cycles, indifferent to the history that unfolded on their fields. The churches hold services, the grain moves from field to silo to market, the seasons turned according to patterns older than nations or ideologies. But the people change, and the changes matter. And the accumulation of changes shapes the world in ways both visible and invisible. The prisoners of war who came to America expecting punishment and found instead a kind of education were changed by their experience. Some of them carried that change back to Germany and used it to build something better from the ruins. Others stayed and became Americans, adding their stories to the great mixing of cultures and peoples that define this nation. Neither outcome was planned or predicted. Both happened because individuals made choices, because circumstances created opportunities, because even in the midst of catastrophic violence, the possibility of connection and transformation remained.
The men who once saluted tyranny now saw freedom planting its fields, and it was enough to make them believe that maybe, someday, Germany could grow something just as enduring. That belief, tentative at first but strengthening over time, became the seed from which post-war German democracy grew. Not the only seed, there were many others, planted by many people under many different circumstances. But a seed nonetheless, carrying within it the potential for something new. And in the end, that is what history is. Not the story of great man and decisive battles, but the story of seeds planted and tended, of small changes accumulating into large transformations, of ordinary people learning and teaching and building, generation after generation, towards futures they can imagine but never fully predict. The prisoners of war who worked American farms during World War II were part of that story. Their names are mostly forgotten, their individual contributions impossible to measure, their lives unremarkable, except for the moment when history swept them up and deposited them in a place they never expected to be, where they learned lessons they never expected to learn. But they were there, and they learned, and they passed on what they learned. And because of that, the world became, in some small way, a better place than it would have been otherwise. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all history ever offers. The chance to learn, to change, to build something better than what came before, knowing that perfection is impossible, but improvement is always within reach for those willing to do the work.